Hi guys, let's talk about shutter speed and motion in photography. So our objectives are demonstrate skill and knowledge in using shutter speed effectively to capture blurred and frozen motion images for creative effect. And then second, be able to distinguish the difference between fast and slow shutter speed in images. Our first words worth knowing is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time the shutter in the camera stays open. So when you hear that click, that's the shutter opening and closing. Shutter speed affects how motion appears in photographs. Second is TV. TV mode stands for shutter priority. It actually stands for time value, but we call it shutter priority. TV is a camera mode where you are going to choose the shutter speed and the ISO, and the camera is going to choose the correct aperture for you as you change your shutter speed. So the camera will adjust depending on what you set your shutter speed on. So how do you control the appearance of motion in photography? There's three things, so we're going to go over them briefly, then look at them in detail. So the first is angle of view. Angle of view is how far the object moves across the frame. Second is distance. Distance is if an object is closer to the camera, it's going to capture more movement. And then third is shutter speed. So the faster the shutter speed, the less time the object has to move across the frame and the motion is going to be frozen. The slower the shutter speed, the more time the object has to move across the frame and your motion will be blurry. So let's look at these in detail. So first is angle of view. So your lens size refers to its angle of view. So the longer that lens, the smaller the angle of view because everything's going to be close up and compacted. So lenses can be wide, telephoto, normal, and zoom. So here is a little diagram. So the wider the lens, the more frame you have, the more you can see in front of you, and then the longer it is, the less you can see in front of you. So this is an example of a 35 millimeter standing from the same spot, a 50, and then 105. So just changing the lens, you're going to change your angle of view. Here's another example. You can pause if needed. So the longer the lens, the less you can see in front of you, the more compacted it is. So the second thing that affects motion is your distance. So the closer the subject is to the camera, the more it's going to show movement. So you have to think, it's because the subject is taking up more space in the frame, your angle of view. If your subject is this little teeny tiny thing in the background and it's moving, it's not going to show motion as more because it has more space to move. If it's closer, so for instance my hand, if I go like this, it's going to show motion a lot more if I take a photo than if it's all the way back here and if I move it. So think about how close is your subject. If you want to show more motion, think about having them closer. And then also we need to remember the exposure triangle in this because next is shutter speed. When we move one part of that triangle, we have to move the others to compensate. So shutter speed, like I mentioned before, is how quickly the shutter opens and closes. It's like a timer. It's measured in fractions of a second, and the smaller the fraction, the less amount of time the shutter is open. So the less amount of time your subject has to move across the frame, boom, it freezes it. And then on your camera, the shutter speed is right there. It is measured in fractions of a second, so don't forget that. So 1/1000th is a very fast shutter speed. So again, if you have a slower shutter speed, so at a second, the object or whatever your subject is has more time to move around that frame, where if it's fast, it only has a split second to move before it's captured. So let's look at some examples. These are by Harold Edgerton. So the bullet going through the apple, the little drop, his work is very, very famous. Walter Ayuse, so capturing sports. Lois Greenfield does a lot with advertising and especially dance. Seth Castile, he has all these awesome images of dogs jumping into water. And then Clark Little, who's out of Hawaii, who captures waves and all sorts of things Hawaii related. But again, lots of fast shutter speed, freezing that motion. So some slow shutter speed examples. Miss Geiser's personal favorite, Francesca Woodman. She did a whole bunch of self-portraits that utilized slow shutter speed. Gunnar Heilman, using light painting. Alexei Titarenko, again slow shutter speed over a long period of time, capturing the movement in cities. So let's summarize. So the three things that control motion in your photos. First is your angle of view. So the size of the frame. Are you using a long lens and have a smaller frame? Are you using a wide lens and you have a really wide frame? Your shutter speed. So how fast or slow is your shutter speed? How long is that shutter open to capture the movement like it's painting on your frame? And then distance. The closer your subject is, the more it's going to show motion. The further back it is, the less it's going to show motion because it's smaller in the frame. And then don't forget about your lenses. They can be wide, which shows a lot of scene in front of you, even more than what your eye can see. Normal is about your eye, a 50 millimeter, and telephoto is very close up. So all of these things work together to capture motion. So your photo assignment. You're going to be shooting 5 different subjects that show motion. That should be the point of your images. For each subject, you're going to shoot using a fast shutter speed and a slow shutter speed. So this is going to have you changing your settings. So you need to be aware of what you're doing. For a total of 10 photos. So 5 showing blurred movement with a slow shutter speed, and then 5 showing a fast shutter speed where your motion should be frozen. So you're going to have to take a lot of time and really practice using that camera. You can use TV, which is shutter priority. So you can be setting your shutter speed and then setting it and forgetting it. Or you can use manual if you're ready. When you're using TV though, there's a little bit of a trick to it. You can't just set it and forget it if you don't know what you're doing. You need to choose your ISO, so depending on whether we're inside, outside, the lighting around us. Then you're going to move your selection dial to choose your shutter speed. So I prefer you have this on the back of your camera so you can see what you're doing. So this would be 15 seconds. This would be a very, very slow shutter speed. And then your camera is going to choose the aperture that makes the light meter go in the middle. Remember, it's averaging all the light to get a medium gray. However, if you're trying to shoot at a fast shutter speed and your ISO is not set correctly, the aperture is going to blink and you're going to get images that are too dark or too light depending on what you have it set on. If your camera is blinking, it's telling you there is not enough or too much light to make the image you want to take. You need to go back and adjust. Either adjust your aperture, or I would start with your ISO. Was your ISO set correctly? Again, if you need help in class, just ask. But I really want you guys to get the feel of starting to use this camera as a tool and know what you're doing as you shoot. I can't wait to see the images you guys come up with. Good job.